this too high? Can you hear me? That's embarrassing. And I was very touched by Meryl's introduction. I'll say some more about my hosts in the course of the speech. Should I go down one like this? Is that better? Yeah. I'm just going to launch right in and say thank you in the middle. We all hope to get to heaven. And then there comes a second step. Some of us want to make heaven here. And it's that step, making heaven here, I'm going to talk about today. I want to describe a group that wanted to make heaven here. So you imagine some college seniors juniors from a very distinguished state university, big one, that is the pride of the state, go off on a trip with some 30-year-olds mixed in there. That would be their thought leaders. Think of students, activists going on a trip with their thought leaders. So they get in their student vehicles, maybe Volkswagens at the time, maybe older cars, and they go to a beautiful lake spot with cabins and picnic tables. And it sort of is like heaven. And the wind blows through their hair, and they're young, and they decide to lay down plans to make America heaven. Built in the 1930s, you can just imagine. It's simple. It's dumpy. They like it that way. They like the simplicity. They can see the stars in the sky. And they start to talk. They get down to work. They know several things. They're activists. They've been on picket lines in rough places. Some of these students have researched problems of the United States. They've seen genuine racial injustice. They've seen poor people, or poverty, I suppose. One of the older attendees at this retreat of students has written a book about a topic that will sound familiar. He writes a book about poverty in Appalachia. Kind of a hillbilly elegy. And he won some attention for that. And these students, what do they plan? They're going to take the lead in policy work, and they're going to do it independently. They're not cogs, right? They're going to speak truth to power, and they're going to maybe work with labor unions, but they're going to work as a strong partner. Maybe they'll help unionization, particularly at growing companies, kind of the Amazons of their time. And they're going to make the workplace fairer for women and disabled people and minorities, and they're going to have, everyone's going to have a voice at the important tables, kind of the ESG. And they're going to be sure the government provides for poor people and all the money is shared around. And while they're at this lake drinking, thinking together, they write a manifesto that says all this. And deplores the domination of big corporations in society and argue for distribution. What are the premises of what they're writing in this manifesto? One is they really do think they're independent. Another is that they want to be more ambitious than their elders. Not just civil rights, not just social democracy. Why not go farther? Why not real ideals? What's wrong with socialism? They ask each other. We don't want a good society, we want a great society, we want heaven. And a premise after that to this little group by the lake is America can afford it. Whatever we plan, if it becomes policy, America can afford it. It shouldn't be hard. America won war in Europe. America did this and that. Getting rid of poverty in America, that's just what one of the commentators observing them called a mopping up action. Poverty, it will be no problem. I'll read you one line from the manifesto they published. We are, and you'll notice their attitude towards wealth, we are people of this generation, bred in at least modest comfort, housed in universities, looking uncomfortably at the world we inherit. They send their friends the manifesto, they leave the lake, and one of their friends actually gets to take the ideas to Washington. That's the fellow who wrote the book on Appalachian poverty. He is a socialist. He's frank about that. And miracle of miracles, this young man does get an appointment on Pennsylvania Avenue at the White House, and he gets offered a job, one of this little group, to work on the new poverty law. And he knows he can't say he's a socialist too loud. It's a Democrat in the White House, but he's not sure that will go over. So he puts the socialism aside for the moment, puts on a tie, and works for the new poverty law, which did become law. And inside, though, he's still thinking, why not socialism? And he tells others that. This story sounds very current, but it actually comes from another idealistic period, the early 60s. So I'm going to use my time here to tell what really happened at that meeting, which took place in Port Huron, Michigan. And more importantly, what happened after it, and to some extent as a result of it, in the 1960s federal campaign that became known as Great Society. The story doesn't quite tell what happened in the 60s as the history books do. I have some variation, and that's part of our problem, and maybe also part of our optimism. Perhaps you've noticed Texas and the Southwest are more optimistic than Michigan. This story offers a clue as to why. It does take a few minutes more to tell, which is why I'm grateful to Tom Giovanetti, who's not here. May he heal well, and IPI, my other friends here, John Fund, Bastia Society, I saw was tweeting about this, and the Sumners Foundation for supporting the event, Ms. Resnick. Glad to have the time. Tale starts at that lake, Port Huron, and the young people actually were Michigan students, and they wrote what was called they called it the Port Huron Statement. That was there, but it was a manifesto. And they founded a group that became known as Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS. And a year or so later, that young writer, who was not J.D. Vance of Hillbilly Elegy, now I think running for office, but another young man named Michael Harrington, did get to go to Washington and participate in a way in the writing of some poverty legislation known as the Economic Opportunity Act. That's the settled part of the story. But the unsettled part, the questioning, the part I want to look at again, and that I discovered only that it was controversial when I researched this book, was though the young people thought they were independent, coming up with all this themselves, they really weren't. The land they were meeting on, the center by the lake, which is called Four Freedoms, belonged to a big labor union, the United Auto Workers. And the mind behind the meeting, I'm not a paranoid person, but I will say the mind behind the meeting, it wasn't the students' mind, it was the mind of the leader of the United Auto Workers, whose name was Walter Reuther. And the writer who went to Washington got an entree, lucky guy, at the White House because the United Auto Workers placed a phone call and opened a door for him. So it was a slightly different story from Young People Speak Truth to Power. That's the first part. And the name Reuther is not known that much any longer in this state. It's a hard name too, R-E-U-T-H-E-R. But it was on the television every night in the 1960s. Walter Reuther of the UAW said, Reuther was not a traitor. He did not work for Moscow or Beijing, but he did really sincerely believe in something close to socialism, let's say heavy social democracy. And I think in this story he plays a role similar to that of George Soros, which is to say that he's behind a lot of ventures with money, and some outcomes are different because of his funding or political support, going back to the 60s. One of them was funding community action. The UAW was behind that. The very creation of the student group SDS had to do with the union. The mischief when students got violent, which they sometimes did. From Reuther's point of view, he was not a particularly violent man. He didn't advocate violence. What he thought he was doing was trying to get a youth wing for the United Auto Workers, because the United Auto Workers was old and mostly tradespeople, and now more Americans were going to college, and now 18-year-olds were clearly going to get the vote. Well, if his union is going to stay strong, it needs some young members, even if they're a little bit hokey and have different views and wear different clothes. Walter Reuther generally wore a suit or at least a tie, right? So he saw this pragmatically. The youth wing of the United Auto Workers he would fund, and they would help him reform across the land. And he was confident because he had achieved much in his career through pressure on the big industries in those days. He got a kind of social democracy at automaker factories, you know, health care benefits at the big three, for retirees, pension benefits, disability benefits, very strong unions. From his point of view, every American should be in a union, and it was irritating to him, too, this is now the 60s or the 50s, to watch companies and workers flee to less unionized states, such as Texas. His idea was he wanted to end what's called the right to work exception for a state like yours, so that all America would be union land. That was something important. And he thought that he had built heaven already for the employees of the big automakers of the big three, and he also thought, we can afford it. It's a refrain in this story, we can afford it. He's so bent on building heavens that he actually built one for his own workers at Black Lake, Michigan, a retreat. Black Lake was much fancier than Port Huron. You get there by going with a little Learjet. You land, and there's all this Scandinavian architecture, Douglas firs, beautiful aspen, oak, and pine setting. And Black Lake has sturgeon, and you can imagine Walter Reuther's vision. This is a worker paradise, retreat for conferences, where workers feast on their own caviar from their own sturgeon in their own lake. But Reuther is important because he had bigger ambitions. He didn't just want to build a paradise for auto workers, he wanted to build paradise for all Americans. After all, automakers in America could afford it. And he believed the kind of thing, there was a joke that circulated about Stalin and what he said about America. Stalin said, socialism or communism is good, but the only country that can afford it is the United States. To give you an idea, right? And so this union leader, this Reuther fellow, was pushing presidents, first John F. Kennedy and then Lyndon Johnson, to adopt reforms that would take America closer to heaven. And they listened to him. And I don't even think we can imagine how much influence he had, but here is why. Reuther was part of the AFL-CIO with George Meany, the great umbrella organization of unions, which were more powerful than private sector unions, and they had 13 million odd members. And they told the public, and this was accurate, that they could count about 10 million votes they were sure of. So the endorsement of the AFL-CIO or the AFL-CIO and Walter Reuther's UAW, effectively a subset at that time, that was enormously important to politicians in elections. How important? In the 24 hours after the assassination of President Kennedy, the new president, President Johnson, placed his key calls. And one of the first people he calls is Walter Reuther. Johnson to Reuther. You can hear this on, on the White House tapes on YouTube now. I need your friendship, more than I ever did in my life, Walter. And Ruther promised he and his union would give friendship, but of course Ruther expected things in return from the new president: health care, retirement benefits, wider welfare, ending poverty. He wanted President Johnson, the new president, to take the Union land and make all of America Union land. And lo and behold, a kind of miracle from Ruther's and the students' point of view did occur. Remember, I said these students are from Michigan, so Ann Arbor. In 1964, an election year, the new president, Lyndon Johnson, comes to Ann Arbor. It's as if he came to Austin, right? Ann Arbor, and announces that he will ensure across the land not just a good society, but a great society. And in this period, Johnson follows the playbook of his own advisors, including the unions, and writes dramatic changes: new civil rights laws, health care for the poor, that we call Medicaid, health care for senior citizens, that we call Medicare, massive 100 million and then billion housing projects and rebuilding of cities. It's worthwhile to go back to Johnson's speeches from that period, particularly his Michigan Great Society speech, but also others, just to take in the scope of President Johnson's commitment. He didn't promise, President Johnson, to alleviate poverty incrementally. He promised to cure poverty, C-U-R-E. Good was not enough. 64 for Johnson was an election year. He was running on his own. You had to promise paradise and get to great. And you know about Johnson, because you're from Texas, he was pretty good at getting laws through Senate, right? Master of the Senate. He could come up with the laws and get them through the legislature so fast, probably better than anyone on earth. Johnson made laws, one of his advisors, Joe Califano, said, the way other men eat chocolate chip cookies. And that's also the way he quantified his success. Some of us have thought about, well, inputs are one thing, but what is the result? Johnson quantified his success by his inputs, not by his results. That was for another year for someone else to quantify. Measure, as I, as a master politician, measure of what I do is how many laws and how big I pass and how big those laws are and how much they cover. So by that measure, in Johnson's calculus, he was an enormous success. Just about everything became law. The economic opportunity, the civil rights, which started as laws about opportunity, but morphed with the key speech President Johnson gave at Howard U, into equality of result, which is different from equality of opportunity, of course. That was a commitment. We did get Medicare, Medicaid. We got upward pressure on wages. We got a lot of community reconstruction. And early on, you're watching all this, the 60s are passing. You know that at the same time we were ramping up in Vietnam. Some of you will remember. Doubts begin to set in. After we passed the civil rights law, the key one, only after, was the Watts riot, a terrible riot in Los Angeles. After all the commitments by Johnson came the troubles. And the Watts riot in '65, which was so terrible, was one of the events that contributed to Johnson's decision not to run again. He didn't know what more he could do for people. He had spent so much, and he wasn't sure he knew the way domestically, in addition to the challenge of Vietnam, which is much more discussed and covered in the history books. But idealism dies hard, and here's another place where you might, want to widen your reading. When the new president came, who happened to be a Republican, not a Democrat, Richard Nixon, contrary to his reputation as so different as a penny-pinching conservative, Nixon continued the Great Society. He had a different name for it. He called it the Abundant and Just Society. But he expanded on the welfare state that President Johnson and Congress had created. He put through the laws that created national public radio, than public TV. Of course, as you know, he did much work in the environmental sphere that we discussed today. I neglected the radio and public television in my book, and I shouldn't have, because they are suppliers of much of the narrative we get about this period. So groups that were created by the government also supply the arguments for the government to many listeners we know, especially younger people who have a whole diet of only public radio. Former Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan did some math with Adrian Wooldridge and also John Cogan did, and they counted up and said effectively President Nixon expanded the Great Society by 20%, and at a rate faster than Johnson. What else was going on? And here the doubts of Federal Reserve was effectively supporting these projects with relatively low interest rates, though not as low as currently. Fed Chairman William McChesney Martin, I know you've had monetary events, told the famous story about how the Fed's job, and this may be new to the students, but some of you have heard it, the Fed's job is a difficult job. The Fed is the man at the party who takes the punch bowl away just when the party gets going. That is, tightens interest rates just when the economy feels good. But even William McChesney Martin later said he didn't take the punch bowl away fast enough himself as Fed chairman, and certainly his successor, Arthur Burns, who's treated in my book in the chapter Burns Agonistes, did not take the punch bowl away. So the Fed was complicit and did some strange things. And we began to feel inflation, and the courts did their part too. One of the little disgusting key decisions of the Supreme Court, we talk a lot about school integration, but this is a different one, is one I just learned about in research called Goldberg v. Kelly. And what Goldberg v. Kelly says is welfare payments are not discretionary. They're not up to the lady social worker who is so often hated. Of course, she comes and tells you whether you get the money. They are like property welfare payments. That is, you're entitled to them. This is the period when we got the word entitlement, right, as opposed to discretionary payment from the government as a benefit. And that made it very hard for these entitlements or commitments to weaker groups in society to be altered. Reuther's dream plans were just about all implemented in the Great Society. I think this is obscured in our books. As I say, everything is contextualized by Vietnam. Well, the Vietnam War was on what could he do. We went from 50 to 500,000 men in Vietnam. What Johnson had to do it at home to keep the peace. I'm not sure that's true. And then there's an analogous argument. We spent so much, but the way we got in trouble and had that inflation, all that was Vietnam. That is not so either. Vietnam cost a lot in the 60s, but as early as the 1970s, our social commitments cost more than Vietnam. You hear guns and butter. Guns are the war spending, and the butter is the domestic. In the back of my book, I have a chart, and you can see where butter outpaces guns very soon after the period I'm describing. The Great Society solidified the New Deal before it and extended it. A side note that is absolutely key to Texas, so busy were our authorities passing all these laws, these chocolate chip cookies, that they failed to do one thing that the unions wanted and Johnson promised to do. They failed because of a filibuster led by Everett Dirksen. Who in this room knows who Everett Dirksen is? Plenty of you. Everett Dirksen of Illinois, because of a long filibuster, they failed to get through the Senate repeal of the right to work escape hatch. That meant that we were going to continue the natural experiment. Some states are right to work, others are more closed and unionized. Let's see which grows faster. That was a kind of historical accident, I think, a kind of a historical miracle that didn't happen, so we could observe that experiment and draw our own conclusions. And one of the critics in the whole period was actually Governor Connolly of Texas, who said, look, with your minimum wage stuff that you have, if we follow all your rules from Washington on this, Texas will become less competitive and we'll have to lay people off here in Texas. He called the government authorities to complain as governor. It got a little bit darker every year going into the 70s, and Ruther of the UAW himself didn't even live to see all the consequences. And that's because of a tragedy. One evening, about 10 years after Port Huron, he loaded Mrs. Ruther and his architect for his fancy modern retreat, Mr. Stonerov, into one of those little Learjets to fly to Black Lake and console himself with an inspection trip of his model train set, so to speak, his dollhouse, what we console ourselves with when a big project isn't going well. His hobby, and the plane, the little Learjet, flew into a storm and it crashed. And all the Ruthers the Ruthers and their friends on that plane died instantly. It was terrible. But I wondered, looking at the period, maybe that was a small blessing for him because he didn't live to see the full damage that he had wrought through his vision of American heaven as activated by Presidents Nixon and Johnson. Some of the Great Society was, I will say, good. I support the civil rights laws, and they did improve opportunity and dignity and well-being for minorities, African Americans. Medicare and Medicaid, John Goodman is here, felt good at the time. Okay, thank you for that, but right now we're passing on to our idealistic children a burden that surely is no blessing with Medicare and Medicaid. But there were many Great Society projects whose damage became evident very fast. Who paid? First of all, the students who were very confused by what they had wrought. Some of them went off and became weathermen, you know. Most of them just became university professors, which is another kind of damage, probably more important. But they all had a kind of wistful embarrassment about what they'd done. More important, though, is that America paid as well, even as the unions and automakers who colluded, Henry Ford, were pushing up wages and benefits. The Corollas and the Volkswagens were rolling onto the docks at Long Beach and in Boston. And the beginning of the great challenge to America's proudest industry, autos, was arriving. It turned out automakers, we couldn't afford it. Automakers could not afford all the benefits they promised. And that was going to be a problem. We gutted our greatest industry in our effort to appear fair and magnanimous. The tragedy that played out when the Midwest became the Rust Belt played out on a national scale. Poverty did not get cured. Indeed, the reduction in poverty decelerated subsequent to the Great Society. Got stuck at around 10%, the poverty rate. Instead of freeing poor Americans, we enshackled them into a sort of institutionalized culture of entitlements. You know, one lady said, who was honest about it, who was in the welfare movement, she said, they give you freedom with one hand and take it away with the other. And that is always what welfare is. People lost hope, family pathology hardened. You think of the book about Appalachia that's more recent, not Michael Harrington, but J.D. Vance. And then there's the economy, and here's the replay Merrill was thinking about. We deprive lower earners of the one thing that we do owe them, in my view, that could really lift them up, which is a job. The unemployment in the 70s was very high. We call it stagflation because we had inflation and unemployment. The Dow just sat, we're all worried about the Dow this week. The Dow was supposed to go over 1,000, it never did the whole decade. Can you imagine if the low that we have today would last for 10 years? Or more. That's what would happened in that period. We began to confront our currency challenges. We spent so much that inflation emerged as uncontrollable, and that sounds familiar too. The 70s, some of you remember the 70s, but just to remind us, was a kind of purgatory and waiting room of a decade, right? There were a lot of good ideas, but they didn't always get to market. The taxes were too high, we ran out of things, and even the 80s were not always pleasant. You think of what was the interest rate in the early 80s when you wanted to buy a house? 17, 18%. Now we're suffering because it's over 6, right? We can't even conceive, but what it what it was the house you were buying had one fewer bedrooms than the house you wanted, right? I want a 3-bedroom, but I can only afford a 2-bedroom. That's what it meant, or a 1.5 bedroom, and I'm gonna build out, I don't know, the sunroom into a bedroom later. It was a terrible diminishment of expectations that we punished ourselves with. I can see my friends coming, so I'm gonna close. I think you can't underrate the value of the example that Texas and the Southwest provided to the rest of the country. A little bit freer, doing a little bit better. Why? That natural experiment. And in Washington, again, eventually our leaders began to reverse. You think of President Clinton and Newt Gingrich from Congress saying, it's time to end welfare as we know it. That was out of the Great Society. What can we do? And why is the idealism coming back? One is nothing is new, it's just forgotten. We're just far enough away from the Great Society to find heavy idealism and the search for heaven kind of appealing. Young people don't know. Older people don't know what happened in the Great Society. That is partly due to our media. I would say the progressive media are too idealistic and the conservative media are way too angry. And that is way too populist. That is our fault. So we could change that. If you would rather yell than solve, you're going to let younger generations down. I'll just stop and say, Tom Giovanetti and I were talking about the challenges I just described, and the greatest is definitely the idealism. The best policy is to hope for heaven, but not to seek to make America heaven. Make life, think in increments, and make life a little better, especially perhaps through the private sector, as some of you do. And some of the clues to how you do that indeed lie right here in Texas. Thank you very much.